We're really excited to have Haley join us. She is an attorney, she has autism, and she's going to talk to us some about neurodiversity in the workplace and what that looks like and share some of her story. Haley, we're really excited to have you join us today. Welcome, and I'll let you take it from here and tell us a little bit more about you and your experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited to talk about neurodiversity at work. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Haley, as Mary mentioned, and it really is a pleasure to get to join all of you out in Alaska. Wow. I got to visit last year before COVID shut everything down, and it's just wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. And like you heard, I'm an attorney. I am the author of 2 books. I have another one coming out about neurodiversity for lawyers and other professionals coming in June. I don't know how we're already at summertime, but time seems to fly. And I am also an artist. I am also an advocate, and I just really want to be able to make a difference for other people with disabilities and autistic people as well. So today's presentation is about neurodiversity at work, which is always super exciting because it's not just autism, but we do have quite a bit of a focus on autism today. So let's get started. And I'm really just excited to share. I think that this is something that is timely for everyone, whether you're a parent, whether you work in hiring people, or whether you're just curious, or you work in HR, VR, whatever it may be, but there's always something we can learn. And of course, because I'm still an attorney, I like to give a little bit of side of law and policy as well. I find it really exciting. And I got to teach similar stuff to my college students. So I actually am an adjunct professor as well, and they really enjoy learning about workplace issues because they don't think about it when they think about their autistic clients when they grow up and they leave college. So this is just something that I think is universal for everyone, no matter what your connection to autism is. And I'm just really excited. So before we get started, I have a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. It's usually pretty simple stuff. It just has to be said though. So as someone who does spend a lot of time in the disability space, everything for me needs to be accessible. And I want that for all of you. I know that we're all very busy. I know that we're all sometimes very stressed. I know we all have a lot going on. And whether or not our presentation is accessible for you means a lot of different things. So for some of us, that means that you're told to not use your camera or not use your mic. We are in webinar format, so don't worry. I can't see you. I can't hear you. I can't judge you in that basis. So I try to be as inclusive as humanly possible to all kinds of learners, all kinds of ways of processing and cognition, et cetera. So something about accessibility at the forefront of everything I do is that no one person has the ability to grant or gatekeep access. That's something we do together, right? So whatever I can do in my power to make this more accessible for you, please let me know. This is something that I like to let everybody know. So if you need to take a break, if this is too much, this session's being recorded. If you need to answer the phone, if you have to stand up, if you have to stim, you just feel overwhelmed or something else comes up during the next hour and a half that we're spending together, then this is no judgment. Do what you have to do. If you're one of those people that is scared that you're being rude by ignoring your body signals and taking a break or getting food or getting a drink, again, no judgment. Do what you have to do. If you've seen me beforehand, you noticed I've been drinking a Diet Coke before we got started. I will probably take a couple sips throughout because that's something that my body needs, and my body will give you the signals while I'm talking. So things like that. For those of us who have visual impairments, we are also making sure to be inclusive of you too. So I have alt text on the slides. If you need a copy of the slides for cognition purposes or anything, please let me know. So slides are also screen reader accessible. And for those of you who do have visual impairments, just to describe myself so you all have a kind of a picture of what you see other than my slides, that again, I have red hair. It's about a little bit past my shoulders. It's long. I have bangs framing my face. I have brown eyes, and I'm also kind of pale. So, and I talk a lot. So you sometimes see that my hands are moving, and my background is a nice virtual office with bright blue walls, and you see some stuff hanging up, and you see a lamp to what should be, I believe, on the left. So I like to let everyone know that just as a nice practice of how we can be inclusive of friends with all sorts of disabilities, not just autism and other forms of neurodiversity. So just things to keep in mind as we move forward today. And because I know that we also are dealing with a wide range of disabilities as well, I like to start by defining what autism is, because everyone has a different definition, whether they're going by the DSM or they're using different models of explaining disability. So here's the best definition that I've been able to come up with that helps account for the fact that every single person on the autism spectrum is different. Is that autism is a complex neurological condition and developmental disability that is characterized by a spectrum of differences, meaning that all of us have very different ranges of these things in social communication and interaction. That means some of us may be verbal and talking like I am with you right now. Others might use alternative technology and other ways of communicating. We might see some heightened sensory processing and experiences. That means for me, I'm really bad at things that are loud and crowded. It's very difficult to have those kinds of sensory experiences, while some people are very sensitive to touch. Some might be sensitive to taste. So everybody has very different experiences with this too. Intense passions or interests and repetitive behaviors. So that's a nice way of saying that how we experience the world might be different than you do. And each person has different things that they struggle with and also things that they are very good at. And just so we know how many people we're talking about and why this topic, especially as we talk about young adults and transitioning to the workforce, and eventually, because I know for most parents, the biggest fear is one day your kids grow up. And I think that's something that most of us struggle with because growing up is hard. And I know even for my parents, they think about, wow, Haley is somehow an adult, and that's awesome, but Haley's an adult. So 1 in 54 kids are autistic, and autistic adults make up about 5.4 million people. That's about 2.2% of the population. So there are a lot of us that are coming of age or are of age, and especially in this most recent generation of young people. So people like myself who are millennials that came of age like right after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, that we were born after that. We grew up with that. So we grew up with IDEA in our schools, and we had access to special education more so than people who were born before us. And we had all of these different opportunities because the law was on our side, and we were able to pursue our dreams more so than people who are older than us. So we also have a better job at identifying autistic people and other neurodivergent people. So that's always been a plus to see. And that's why those numbers keep going up year after year. If you're like me and you like numbers and you're thinking, but once upon a time, that number was like 1 in 1,000. And I'm like, yeah, and now we're just better at identifying people, especially women and girls and people of color and LGBTQ folks and people that might not just be from this country. We're getting really good at making sure that we're reaching the most amount of people and helping people meet their needs. So that's always a good thing to keep in mind. Which brings me to, before we get started on neurodiversity as a whole, we got to know what neurodiversity really is. So neurodiversity is something that takes care of and explains a lot of people. So neurodiversity is this concept that says that neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. So we all have different abilities. We all have different ways of experiencing the world. We have different types of experiences, and that's a good thing. So people who fall under neurodiversity or that might be considered neurodivergent are people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, other learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome, intellectual disabilities, and depending on who you're talking to, you might also see some mental health disabilities end up in this category. So a lot of folks that I know with things like schizophrenia or bipolar will identify as neurodivergent, and that's part of their experiences is they have differences in cognition and thinking and experiencing the world because they have differences in their neurology and their neurotype. So people who have kind of the standard equipment of brain function are known as neurotypical, while people who have a different type of neurology like me are neurodivergent. So that's something you'll see a lot throughout today is when I say people who are neurodivergent or neurodivergence, it's people who have any range of these different types of differences and other disabilities, because something that happens a lot, and I know that this is April, this is Autism Acceptance Month, is people easily get confused and think neurodiversity is a synonym for autism. And something that I think is really important to walk away with is knowing that's not the case. It is not a synonym. Neurodiversity and neurodiverse groups include a lot of different people. And that's kind of the beauty of the whole thing, if we're being honest, is that we have so much diversity in how our brains work and how we think and experience the world. And neurodiversity, as it turns out, is a really, really good thing when we're talking about employment. It's really good when we think about the workforce as a whole. So we have German technology company, SAP, and they were one of the first adopters of having neurodiversity in the workplace and actively recruiting autistic people. So they had a neurodiverse team that included both neurotypicals and neurodivergent folks. And that team created fixes for the technology company that saved them nearly $40 million. And I'm like, wow, that's a lot of money. And it turns out we had that innovation. We had all sorts of different creative skills and different types of problem solving. We had all this really cool stuff going on. And when people hire people with disabilities, it's not just the thing that makes us feel good, because I know a lot of us think, oh my God, is my kid ever going to get a job? The good news is yes, with the right support. And also companies and businesses that know that it actually is good for business. I know, shocker. We're not just doing the right thing. It's not that they're just going to think, oh my God, our kids are great because we think they're great. Nope, it actually helps them too. So companies that employ people with disabilities actually make more money. They have higher shareholder returns. They make more profits. Things just look better for them. And I got that really interesting data number of that 28% higher revenues from Accenture. So they did a really great study in 2019 that kind of analyzed how much money they were making, what was going good for companies that were considered disability inclusion champions and what that exactly meant. So the other really great thing that we have that also benefits this case that we think of is this favorable public opinion of businesses and companies that hire people with disabilities and people who are autistic or neurodiverse. So something that I feel really good about is, you've heard that I live in Florida. And here in Florida, one of my local grocery chains, well, I guess they're local throughout the entire southeastern US at this point. I'm not 100% sure, but they're all over Florida. And they're headquartered, I believe, in Central Florida. They're all over the state. And every time I go to my local supermarket, there is a cashier with Down syndrome. I'm pretty sure he's been there for at least 6 years, because that's how long I've lived in my current apartment. So he's been there for 6 years or so. And every time I go, I just feel good about supporting this grocery chain, because I know they are having people with disabilities, especially intellectual and developmental disabilities, on the front lines. They are part of our communities. They're being paid fairly. They're just part of our community. And I feel good knowing that I'm supporting it. And I feel good every time this nice cashier says hello to me. And after a couple of years, because we've seen each other often enough, he'll give me a hug. And it just makes me feel good about myself. And it makes me feel good that this is where my money is going to, a group that genuinely is supporting the employment of people with disabilities. I just feel good about it. I don't have any rhyme or reason to explain it. I just feel happy. I feel confident. I know that I'm supporting having people that deserve to be part of my community and be integrated within my community. And perhaps something more abstract and also more concrete is, we all benefit from working with diverse people. So we all benefit from working with different kinds of minds. This is something that I also learned from Temple Grandin. It's something that we see when we see these technology fixes, the way that even folks at Ernst & Young created different fixes during the pandemic with their neurodiverse teams, that we've seen all sorts of really cool things. Or it's also kind of like how my dad explains this to me. So my dad is neurotypical, and he likes to explain to me is that people like me see things differently. So he's like, most people see things in black and white, or they see that there's like an x-axis and a y-axis. And he goes, well, you see the Z, you see that 3D element, that gray area, that thing in between that maybe someone else might not point out, but you do. And that's been very true. I think a lot about my first job, where I was asked to research some legal standard. And I was like, but wouldn't this be a different standard because of something X, Y, and Z? And my boss was like, I don't know, go look into it. And I did. And it turned out there were two very entirely different standards between what he asked me to look into and the thing that I thought might be the answer. And it turns out the thing that I thought might have been the answer was the thing that won them that motion in court. So it was really cool seeing that, just thinking outside of the box, thinking in that non-linear creative way that is very natural to me. That is how I experience the world. was the kind of thing that was able to help my clients. And I was still just a new lawyer. I've been working for maybe 2 or 3 months at that point, if that. And it was just really exciting to see is that I was able to make a difference based on the unique way that I saw the world and the way that I was able to experience things and think about problems, or maybe create solutions I didn't know that were needed or that the others didn't know were needed. But despite all of these benefits, we have some big problems. We have a huge employment disparity in our community. So we have a high rate of unemployment and underemployment. So that means that we have people who are sitting at home, people who may not be working because it affects their benefits, or we have people that are in jobs that don't necessarily suit their qualifications and experience. So this underemployment is the thing I see the most personally, is you have a lot of very brilliant, young, neurodivergent, and autistic people who may have college degrees or advanced degrees, and they're not doing work that matches that experience because somebody just doesn't want to hire them. They might appear weird, that traditional hiring practices are biased. So when I say that things are biased, I mean that a lot of it kind of just focuses on this ideal type of person who seems to be a good worker. And for those of us with jobs, we all hear that. What is an ideal candidate? What makes someone a good employee? And when you think about it, a lot of it really just seems to be focused on this very neurotypical, very stereotypical version of someone who's super social, super extroverted, a leader, a go-getter, but there's so many different ways to exist in this world. And that's something that I think we need to talk more about, and even just how we do traditional hiring. So these biases are very much in full effect, especially when we think about all these other factors. So misinterpreting communication, our body language, our eye contact. And these things really come to the forefront, especially now with remote hiring and also things like artificial intelligence. So even just the way that like a one-way video remote interview with AI will see you is they might just see your body language looks uncomfortable. You're not looking at the camera. You're not doing these very specific things or you're not smiling enough. All of these little things that we don't really think too much about, or that people might not be as observant of, or maybe they might be. It really depends on the person. But a machine might be taking that data and saying that doesn't make you a good candidate. And then you don't get to actually meet the people or prove that you'd be a good fit somewhere. And also when we say we communicate differently, sometimes autistic people like me are just very honest. We're very blunt. And sometimes that can be kind of off-putting to people who don't know to expect it or just didn't think it would happen. There's also differences in body language and eye contact. So when we were talking about accessibility earlier, I mentioned that I don't care if you have to move your hands, if you have to stim. So that's different ways and different repetitive behaviors. So for me, I often will like click my nails together. I'll move my hands. I might fidget with something. All of these different things that somebody might just think, Haley's not paying attention. Turns out Haley needs to play with something or have something in her hands. So you can't see my hands off screen, but I have a hair tie kind of wrapped around my finger, and I'll wrap it around when I start getting either nervous or I just need to keep my hands busy. There's a reason that Zoom has been kind of good for me in that way. But you'll see that and you might think she's not paying attention, but that's the thing that either is making me feel less anxious or allowing me to keep my focus on all of you. The same goes for something like eye contact. So with autism and other different cognitive differences, what we see is we think people just don't make eye contact because they're not listening, they're not interested. And in some cases, especially when it comes to jobs, we teach people that when someone makes a lot of eye contact, that means that they're telling the truth. It means that they're not hiding something. It means that they're not lying. And when they're looking down or away, you're thinking, that person's got something to hide. I can't trust them. But the truth is, for neurodivergent people, myself included, that eye contact can be really, really burdensome. It could be something that we're not thinking about, or at least you're not thinking about, but we're thinking about constantly. Is, am I looking at you enough? Am I able to pay attention to what you're saying and make you think I'm paying attention to what you're saying? Because for me, if I'm looking at you intently, straight in the eye for too long of a time, all of my energy is going to be used making sure that I'm looking at you and blinking at the right time and looking up and nodding at the right time, and all of those little tiny things that you probably don't think about. And I'm going to miss completely what you said. I think about this a lot in terms of when I was in history class in high school and I would doodle a lot of pictures and my teacher thought I never paid attention, but doodling was the only way I was able to pay attention and my grades reflected it. So she eventually just didn't care and she'd let me just doodle pictures anyway. So I think of eye contact in that same kind of vein is people think that it's a very important thing. And if you're doing it wrong, it is very bad. But it turns out that some people just do better if they're able to focus on something else or don't have to try to accommodate neurotypicals in a world that doesn't often accommodate them. We also see things like gaps in employment. So for our young people or slightly older people, you might see this too, is that sometimes it's just hard to keep a job for whatever the reason. Maybe it was temporary, maybe you were in school, maybe you've been let go a lot because you just weren't seen as a culture fit, or maybe there was just something really difficult, or you were unemployed because you were spending years and years looking for something else. I know people that spend years looking for jobs because they can't find the right fit. And other employers would be, well, this person hasn't been employed for a couple of years. There's probably something wrong. Instead of realizing that this might also be the result of different biases as well. We also have different things with disclosure and discrimination. So people like me often have the conversation of, when am I going to tell someone that I'm autistic? How much discrimination is it going to open me up to? What do I do in that case? And of course, for the employers and different job sites and things, there's a huge fear of the unknown. A lot of people have never worked with somebody who's autistic before. A lot of people have never worked with someone who, say, has a disability that they know of, and they don't know what they're supposed to do. They'll be like, how can I accommodate you? How can I work with you? What am I supposed to do? And that fear prevents them from wanting to even work with us in the first place. It's something that I saw a lot, even in my first jobs. They're like, what kind of accommodations are you going to need? What are we going to do? And I'm like, don't worry, we're in this together. Promise. I got you. I got your back. It's going to be okay. So that kind of brings us to this whole discussion about disclosure. So disclosure is something that our young people are often dealing with in their lives. So most young people with disabilities know that they have disabilities. If you haven't told them yet, you probably should at some point. They will figure out they are different, and they've probably been wondering why. Of course, how you disclose to them is very different than the way that they might disclose to a job. So the way that my parents told me about my autism was related to Harry Potter. The way that I tell my friends is very situational and very need to know basis of like different sensory things, or maybe I don't feel comfortable in this situation. The conversation that I might have when I'm dating someone looks very different than the conversation I might have with a potential employer or my current employer. So people always like to know when the right time to share that they have a disability is when they're looking for a job. And the truest answer is that it really depends on the person. So some people might say it in their cover letter. They might say it when they request an accommodation at some point. They might say it in their interview. It might just come up. It's come up in my interviews because I got in the door because of my autism. And it turns out that the person interviewing me has a child with autism, and they wanted to ask some questions, sometimes on their own personal fact-finding mission, which always feels a little bit uncomfortable at times. Some people wait until they have offers, and some wait until they just need an accommodation more generally. So that used to be my kind of approach, is when do you need an accommodation? And generally speaking, the law has a different answer. You don't have to say anything until you need an accommodation, because you are legally entitled to an accommodation that is reasonable under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I see we have some comments and things coming in live time. I'm seeing if I can pull them up to see if they're relevant to our discussion, or if there's anything y'all want me to address as well, but it won't let me pull them up. So I'm having a little bit of faith in that right now. Okay, here we go. Oh, never mind. Not related to us. We got this. So if you guys have any questions as we're going through, feel free to pop them in, because I'm one of those people who also forgets questions until the end. And I know it's really hard sometimes if you want to hold something in. So if you have something, go with it. If I see it right away, I will try to answer it. If not, then I promise I will get to your questions at the end. Just kind of a random thought while I'm thinking about it. So please bear with me. And of course, something with disclosure, and especially for us parents, because we know we have to talk about this stuff. I am by no means a parent. I just know what my parents did right. And my parents teaching me how to advocate for myself has always been at the forefront, and especially as I became a young person in the workforce. So I am in my mid-20s, and I started learning how to talk about autism when I was 9 or 10. So having these types of discussions is really, really important. And some really wonderful resources about disclosure, actually, especially in the workplace, come from the Department of Labor. So one of my favorite resources is this workbook for young people from the Department of Labor and their Office of Disability Employment Policy. And they basically talk about kind of going through the pros and cons, different things about disclosure. How do we do this? What should we say? How do we go about this? How do we feel empowered in this rather than we have something to feel ashamed of? Because a lot of young people kind of are ashamed of themselves and they wonder, oh my God, how's somebody going to act? It's up to us to empower them so they're ready for any situation. And if the world isn't ready for them, that falls on the world. That doesn't fall on our young people. And of course, people of all ages too, but I usually use young people since most of us are talking about children who are young adults, not yet adults, or are emerging adults. So, and also because depending on who you ask, I consider myself young people in my 20s. So I think of young people as a great way to help contextualize this conversation, especially when we talk about the workforce. And also there's some really cool different resources. I am a huge fan of this one from Virginia Commonwealth University about when to disclose, if you choose to disclose or determine the need, and how to disclose. So they give a lot of pros and cons depending on the situation, whether it's a good idea. And a cover letter, application, when you get interviewed, before, during, or after, and how to start that conversation. So everybody's situation and everybody's comfort level is different. So in a world where my job wasn't getting to talk about this stuff and a world where I was not openly autistic, I don't think I would be disclosing right away. But I realize at this point, if you Google my name, it is probably the first thing you're going to find out about me. So I almost have to knock it out of the park on my disclosure right away, because otherwise somebody thinks I'm hiding something. So whether I need to is kind of not really up to me at this point. It's part of who I am. I'm not ashamed of it. It's just, and I also look at it as if somebody knows and they decide I'm not the right fit for them, then I'm not missing out much. I'm missing out on a place that probably wouldn't have wanted me or accepted me for who I am anyway. And of course, there's some really cool stuff from the Job Accommodation Network, which is also funded by the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. So that gives some really great stuff about how to interview people who are on the spectrum and different do's and don'ts of disclosure. I highly recommend Jan's resources. So I point everybody in this way, especially if they're new to these types of conversations, or even teaching interview skills to our young people, or whatever it is that, or if you are a self-advocate and you are learning some of this stuff too, Jan is probably one of my favorite resources that I can point you to, and I linked them on here too, and that is askjan.org. So they talk a lot about disclosure and how to be good at interviews, because interviews are kind of the worst. They are difficult for a lot of reasons. Which brings us to how we're going to prepare our young people for those interviews, right? So interviewers are always looking for very specific things in that they judge potential job candidates on. I've heard things such as you're being looked at on not only what you're good at and if you're qualified, but also a personality test in a way. So something that I've heard used as a standard, if you have candidates who are all very qualified, is people will use kind of something that's known as like the layover test. Is, would you want to be stuck with this person for hours on end in an airport and be able to have a drink with them in a good conversation? Like, is this someone you would want to be stuck with for 6 hours or 3 hours? Would they be the kind of person you want to hang out with? On top of being the most professional, best qualified person, that I've seen people that get passed over, and especially because I've been on the other side of hiring, because they didn't meet this arbitrary standard of a layover test, which I would have never thought, based on what job experiences and job applications and interviews are saying, I would have never thought that was a standard, but apparently it is. And for a lot of neurodivergent and autistic people, we might not pass that because we're so focused on just showing that we're a good fit, not that we're auditioning based on personality or if we're acting a certain way to impress you. So again, we have this kind of communication gap where we see our behaviors being misinterpreted. So again, eye contact can be seen as not trustworthy. And if I'm fidgeting with like my hair ties or a pen or something nearby, you're going to see it as distracting, or I'm just not listening. And something else that comes up a lot in interviews, especially for those of us who love literal language, and a lot of autistic people do take things very literally and see things very concrete. They don't quite understand the nuances or might not understand things like figures of speech or idioms. So there's certain questions. And the first one that everybody really likes to ask at jobs or potential jobs is, tell me about yourself. Tell me about yourself, depending on the situation, means many, many, many different things. If you asked me right now to tell me about myself, and I didn't know the context or I wasn't told that tell me about yourself at a job interview means something very different. Tell me about yourself means I'm going to tell you all about my hobbies. I'm going to tell you about that I really enjoy painting, that I love to draw, that I also am really excited because this week we're getting some new music from Taylor Swift, and I love Taylor Swift, which you probably don't want to know if you're interviewing me to be your attorney, but just kind of some fun facts. And I might tell you about some of the stuff that I do for fun, because I also love what I do when it comes to neurodiversity and autism and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I might tell you a little bit of that, but really you're asking me about my work experience and my work history and why I'm interested in working for you. But if you tell me to tell me about yourself, you might get a very different story. So something you could do is say, what has your work experience been like? Or tell me about your work experiences leading up to today. And that you might get a better answer that doesn't involve me telling you about that I like to play games, I like to draw pictures, and I like Taylor Swift. You would like a better answer than that, I'm sure, if you're hiring me for a job. And something else that goes really well for a lot of autistic people are skills-based interviews. So show me what you know. And for those of you who ask a lot of questions, that may or may not go as well. And some of us are really not the best at verbally communicating or sharing things because sometimes there's a difference in processing. But if you ask us to do something, it might go really well. So on the other side, I beg of people to please be open-minded, and that's part of it, is changing your style as well, because what we have right now isn't always working and isn't always protecting and empowering our young people and our people on the spectrum and with other cognitive differences and disabilities. So a lot of the times we're told that the problem is that people with disabilities are lazy, that they're not doing their part, they're not getting jobs. And the truth is we're just being excluded a lot. It isn't for lack of trying. So sometimes we have to re-examine our approach to things too, and that is totally okay. And someone actually just asked if skills-based interviews would be a reasonable accommodation request. And I think that absolutely could be considered a reasonable accommodation. That's a wonderful question. And I really think that is reasonable. And some other accommodations that you can request at the interview phase are things that we came up from Jan. And here's some of the ones that Jan had in mind. And I'm pretty sure that reasonable accommodations with skills would be one of them. So Jan actually recommends things like having fewer interviewers. So if you've ever been in front of a panel of people, it can be really, really intimidating. I know when I've been in front of 3 different people trying to gauge me and they're all taking notes, it could be very scary and very anxiety inducing. And I don't know who to focus on. I'm not sure who the best person to pay attention to is. And something else that is helpful for some people is having that first interview done over the phone before we call them in and bring them into a new environment with sensory stuff. In the era of Zoom, this could just be an audio chat. You could also just do video interviews and we can have a conversation with both of us showing our videos. I'm sure going forward, even as we do eventually get back to not working from home in our sweatpants at some point, that could be a reasonable accommodation going forward. And that also brings outside of Jan that when we get back to normal, whatever that may be, is that a lot of things that we thought were once unreasonable are now perfectly acceptable and reasonable accommodations. So that gives me a lot of hope that things will get better for job seekers with disabilities all across the board. So something that both Jan and my friends at the Stanford Neurodiversity Project recommend is that you can request a copy of the interview questions in advance. It's not cheating. It helps people who have cognitive delays and differences to best understand what you might be expecting of them, and they can try to figure out how to best respond. Of course, this might not be reasonable though, if one of the job requirements is being able to think on your feet really quickly, because they might be measuring that in an interview as well. And that's one of those skills that you need, right? So if you're on a think on your feet type role, that probably might not be able to be granted to you, but it is something I've seen a lot. And Stanford also makes their job seekers write out questions and provide them to the interviewers that they may have ahead of time too. So that way both parties know exactly what to expect. Some people are not good at being morning people. Some people's process faster in the morning, some people don't. So you can also even request that an interview occur at a specific time of day, or maybe it's just quieter because maybe like the overwhelm of traffic, or maybe it's just the lights are brighter. I don't know. So this isn't a me thing. This is not something I would personally request, but this is something I got from Jan, and I thought it was super interesting about that a different type of day, it could be something that you can request in order to prepare someone for an interview or request an accommodation at the interview phase. A lot of people don't realize you can request accommodations then, and you can. Accommodations are not cheating. They are not an advantage. They are leveling the playing field so people with disabilities have the same opportunities as people without disabilities. Highlighting that is that this is not special treatment. This is not a leg up. This is leveling the playing field. A lot of folks probably wear glasses that I can't see. I can't see all of your beautiful smiling faces, but some of you probably wear glasses, willing to bet on it. And if I took away your glasses, you probably would have a hard time seeing certain things. Maybe you wouldn't be able to see my face. Maybe you'd struggle reading the slides, or maybe you wouldn't know it's across the room from you. If I told you had to be without them, you'd be at a disadvantage. Having them doesn't make you have better sight than me, who has no glasses or contacts. It just means that we're able to see the same thing and have the same opportunities to enjoy our surroundings. So think of it like that when we talk about accommodations more generally, is that this is something that makes it fair for everyone to have an equitable opportunity, no matter what we do. So we talked about disclosure, we talked about accommodations, and something that people ask me a lot is, what does it mean that you're openly autistic? Because when you hear me talk about myself or other people talk about me, they hear this term a lot and they really don't know what it means. And I say, that is a great question, my friend, because being openly autistic, especially in a work situation, means that I don't have to hide or mask my autism, that it's the freedom to be exactly who I am. So I can move my hands freely. I can share if I get overwhelmed. I can be honest about who I am and myself. Because if you've ever had to pretend to be somebody that you're not, or you had to try to hide things about you that are less than socially acceptable, it gets exhausting, especially when you're expected to kind of act a very certain way. Or as I like to joke, it's be yourself, but not like that. Don't be yourself like that, because that is not socially acceptable. It is not okay to be too awkward, too this, too that, move your hands too much. And you know what? The nice thing is at this point in my life is I don't care. Take it for what it is. If I move too much, that's okay too. And being open means that I also get to weed out the people who don't have acceptance and don't feel comfortable with that. Not everyone has this freedom, and not everyone is able to, and that does not make their experiences less valid than mine. That means that we are all at different places in our journeys with disability. Some of us have pride, some of us have shame, some of us want cures, and some of us do not. But this is a very individual thing. And for me, just being able to be myself no matter where I am is really important and means a lot to me. And again, we have a little bit more about accessibility and accommodations. So we have the employer side of this. So if you've ever been on the other side and now you know that you can request all sorts of really cool things, they might not want to give it to you. Guess what? They kind of have to. So the thing that a lot of employers think is that accommodations cause undue hardship. That is a very nice way of saying they are impossible, or they are just very, very expensive. That is the legal term of that they use to try to get out of it. And literally what covers undue hardship is finance or impossibility. So turns out our friends at Jan found out how much most accommodations cost as a one-time expense. And that usually is about $500 or less. Oftentimes accommodations are free. I know, that's really, really cool stuff. So what do they look like? And for me, I think about my time at work. For some people, it might be getting clear instructions of what to do. It might be being able to wear headphones because the fluorescent lights are too bright, or there's too much chatter, or people are talking too much, or whatever it might be. I wore headphones a lot at work. My boss in my old job didn't care if I wore headphones, as long as whatever I was listening to was not too loud that I couldn't hear the phone ring, because I had to be able to hear the phone ring if they needed something, had a question, or a client was on the line. Totally fair. And that's what made the environment more tolerable for me. Everybody's mileage may vary. It might be being able to take breaks, depending on if you have other health conditions as well. You might get modified hours. There might be all sorts of different things that happen. And most importantly is, how do you get this stuff? Especially if employers aren't going to hand it to you and say, here, we're going to accommodate you. We're going to be super helpful, because most of the time They're not. So honestly, it is an interactive process. It is an ongoing conversation, and it requires a lot of self-advocacy on our part. So we're going to talk about self-advocacy today too, and how you can empower the young people in your life to be able to speak up for themselves and others, which is really cool stuff. So getting accommodations, depending on how big of a place you work for, means you might be going to a supervisor or you might be going to an HR department, and you start that conversation. You let them know you have a disability and what you're requesting. And sometimes you have to work together to find the best solution. So I really don't like fluorescent lights. They're bright, they're loud, they hum, and they give me a headache. Unfortunately for me, I was not able to tell my past supervisor to replace all of them in the building to make my life easier. That would have been a little bit too expensive and a little bit close to. We worked in a pretty big building, but they were able to place me in a room that did not have fluorescent lights, or somewhere with more dim, or somewhere a little bit quieter, or allow me to wear headphones to block out the worst of it. So those are some examples of accommodations and how we were able to come up with that solution by itself. So I didn't just go in there and say, remove all the lights. I just said, these lights are really difficult for my sensory needs. How can we work around this so I can do the best job that I can? And that helped a lot in opening that conversation and being able to get to that place too. Which brings me to something I get really excited about, is this workplace shift and shift overall towards self-advocacy. So a lot of us have heard about self-advocates, which are what people like myself are. And we all think, what does this even mean? Because the first time I heard of self-advocacy and self-advocate, I was like, don't we all advocate? I was very confused. So today I hope to clear up a little bit of that confusion and give us some ways that we can move forward as well. And of course, we have a lot of time for questions. Fear not, friends. So self-advocacy is actually both a movement and a set of skills. So self-advocacy skills empower people with disabilities to make choices that affect their daily lives and allow for greater independence. So the choices and stuff that we make and things we do as self-advocates are really powerful. So we make all sorts of choices every single day, and we also know ourselves and are self-aware of what we need and how we can become more independent. So what do we need to help ourselves, and how can other people help us? This is something all of us do, not just people with disabilities. So don't think this is unique. We just seem to put a lot of focus on it for people with disabilities, because oftentimes, especially parents that I meet, they realize that they do all the advocating for their kids, especially if they have greater support needs. But there are ways to advocate with your kids, and that's really exciting. We're all partners in this together, and at some point, they're going to be adults, and they're going to be taking, their voices should be the ones that are being heard and amplified. And it's your job to help amplify their voices and make sure that they're heard. And that's probably one of the best gifts that you can give, is in terms of confidence and self-esteem, and even getting towards this place of independence or interdependence, where we're able to help each other and get what we need. So self-advocacy is also a movement, and the movement is a lot more interesting in this definition that I found from Minnesota, actually, is that they define self-advocacy as a personal and political philosophy, as a movement primarily of and by people with disabilities making their own decisions, speaking for themselves and for others with disabilities, and taking control over their lives. So it is not only speaking for ourselves, it's also speaking for others and with others. So today, when I'm here, even with all of you, I'm not just speaking for myself and about my own experience, but also about the disabled experience more broadly. So I can only speak for my own experiences and for myself, but I do know that there are some truths that are kind of universal. So I know about bias. I know all sorts of autistic people have different strengths and weaknesses, but I know that things like sensory information can be difficult for a lot of us. And today I get to be the messenger, so to speak. So I get to help kind of be that bridge and help speak on behalf and give kind of a first person perspective. Because I think so often when we talk about self-advocacy and when we talk about workplace, we often hear from professionals and teachers and others. We don't hear from people with firsthand lived experience. So it really means a lot that the folks here at Stone Soup Group did have me as a self-advocate as well. And I get to talk a little bit about some self-advocacy shifts as we move forward. And that also includes these things at work. So this is how we also get to that point of confidence at home and in school and in the workplace. This all is connected, I promise. It's super fun, super exciting. And I have a lot of faith in all of you that are building the next generation of fabulous self-advocates. And something that comes up a lot is when I talk about self-advocacy, a lot of the focus is on teaching young people how they could be better at speaking up for themselves. So a lot of us are allies. We are neurotypical. I am not, but most of you probably are, that you are neurotypical and you probably don't have a disability. So you're not a self-advocate in that sense. And you're probably thinking, what can I do to help somebody? How can I encourage self-advocacy? Other than just going through things about, say, disclosure and starting those conversations, is that we all have the ability to start these types of things in respective settings. So it could be simple as saying no. No is a form of self-advocacy. It is a complete sentence. But sometimes it could be saying, I don't feel comfortable with that. And that you actually listen to that person and respect it. Not just say, no, 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 it's okay, hug grandma, you have to do this. It does come down to consent as well. And sometimes it could be even just learning somebody's needs. So at work, if I said I need to take a break, it would be honored. And I felt like I could advocate for myself in that way. It was very simple. And even in school, there's so many different ways that we can advocate for ourselves. So for those of you who don't have adult kids yet and you have young ones, one of the first things that you can do to encourage self-advocacy, if your child is aware of their disability, they know, and if they are in public school or they're in private school and have either an individualized education plan or a 504 plan, is that you can start taking the kid to the meetings and they can start expressing their own concerns, because after all, IEPs and 504 plans are about the child's education in their goals and what we want for them, right? They're kind of the center of that universe. So I found out about my autism when I was 9. I started going to those meetings immediately after because I knew what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were, and I knew I was different anyway. It wasn't really a big secret in my house at that point because I was old enough to understand that there were some things I struggled with that other kids didn't, and things that I was really good at that other kids weren't. So the first time I got to go to an IEP meeting, I went to a 504, I was in private school, is they were talking about my goals for the year. And I really wanted to make friends because I struggle a lot socially. And they were focusing on my academic goals because I was really good at school and talking about how I should sit at the front of the room so I'm not distracted, because I'm very easily distracted, as some of you may or may not have picked up on tonight or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And what we did is they talked about all that stuff. The adults and the grown-ups talked about things like that. And I was like, I just really want to make friends with girls because all of my friends were boys. And it got written into my plan that the teacher would help me befriend some of the girls in my class or the new girl. And that year I actually was able to succeed at that. And I don't know if that would have came up as one of my goals if I didn't say that at 9 years old, I want to be friends with girls. It was not super complex of a request. It wasn't very complicated. It was, I want to be friends with girls. And that was enough self-advocacy that I got written into my plan. And it was an achievable goal that I actually was able to get done in the 4th grade. It was something I was very proud of, is realizing that my voice mattered. And some way that we could do this for all students and young people in school is there was a really cool hashtag that went around a couple of years ago. And a teacher had all of her students write on an index card and fill in the blanks of a sentence called, I wish my teacher knew. And usually students wrote down things that totally surprised this teacher. They'd write down things like, I want my teacher to know I'm trying really hard to pay attention, but sometimes it's difficult. Or I wish my teacher knew that I don't have that many pencils, so it's not like I'm unprepared. They would write down things about their situation at home, how their brain worked, or they would say something like, I want my teacher to know that I really like Pokemon. And that might be a way that the teacher would eventually be able to connect to the students. So there were all sorts of different ways that we can have these conversations about self-advocacy and that we could be accomplices and allies in making this happen. So we need to make people feel comfortable sharing their stories themselves and being part of the conversation about them. So there's an old saying in disability rights of nothing about us without us. And that goes for all ages and stages. And it's up to us to help build these self-advocates and to encourage people to eventually ask for what they need, including at work. Which also brings me back to disclosing and requesting accommodations. So when we get back to that, is that I always tell people to frame these conversations that empower everybody. And something that a law student taught me, actually, she has ADHD and she's in her 2nd year right now. And I interviewed her for my book. So I have a book coming out in June about neurodiversity for lawyers and other professionals. Please be on the lookout, shameless plug. And when I interviewed her, she said, the best thing that I learned is start every phrase when I ask for accommodations, whether the place will grant them or not, is I work best when. And that lets me say how much I want to say. She did not disclose to her last supervisor she had ADHD, but she said to her employer, I work best when you give me clear instructions or that you give me one task at a time, something of that nature. I work best when blah, blah, blah. And she didn't have to tell them she had ADHD, and they were able to adjust their communication style that way. While in some situations, it might have been best if she said she had ADHD and put it in writing. But in that case, it worked best for her to say, I work best when you give me one task at a time. And something else that seems to come up as in how we disclose and request accommodations is we have to decide who needs to know, right? So when I was at work, I didn't like when my colleagues all knew the ins and outs of my autism because I was always afraid they would treat me differently. And I also thought that when they didn't know at times, they thought I was getting special treatment because my boss might spend more time with me on an assignment. Or in some cases, my boss used to take me to lunch more often than my colleagues because we were working on different projects. And he also just enjoyed catching up with me at least once a month. And most of my other colleagues didn't get that. So it was very weird for them. And they thought, oh, Haley's getting special treatment. No, it's just part of how she's navigating the workplace. And I realized when people knew, they either treated me differently, they thought that's what was the explanation behind certain things, or they just didn't care, which can always happen too. So we also have the pros and cons of that. So again, Jan is a very valuable resource on talking about pros and cons of self-advocacy, disclosure, and requesting. And something else that you can do, especially if you become a really strong self-advocate or you feel comfortable with this, and we can also encourage our kids to think creatively as well, is advocating for new solutions and policies. So the very first place I worked had a fragrance-free policy. And I remember reading this as a fresh-faced 21-year-old intern, being very confused, thinking like, why do they care if I'm wearing perfume or deodorant? I don't understand this. And it turns out that policy existed not to limit deodorant and other, antiperspirants or avoiding BO or other gross things. That policy existed to have things without fragrances because we had somebody in the office who had really bad allergies. And on top of that, those fragrances would cause other employees, such as others on the spectrum, to have sensory overloads. And it was something I never thought would be part of a workplace conversation. And ever since I saw that first fragrance-free policy, I'm like, wow, this is a really cool solution. This is more inclusive for so many people. How hard is it really to avoid perfume or cologne or whatever it may be? Obviously, nothing that's going to make you smell really gross and like you're not clean, because that's not the case and that's not what they're going for. But I thought it was a really interesting thing that you can advocate for things like that and they become part of that conversation. And that's something that I try to do now, is what is something that could benefit everyone? Or you might think you have one accommodation solution in mind, but but what is being offered isn't what you need. So I saw this a lot at school, is anything that would ever be offered was extra time. I was very good at school. I finished most of my tests early. I did not need extra time, but I might have needed a dedicated note taker, or I might have needed a copy of the PowerPoint after class because I might not have been able to follow along. That's also why I offer you guys the slides afterwards if you want them. If you do want them, I'm sure the organizers here at the conference can give them to you, or you can eventually send me an email and I will get them your way. So there are so many ways we can advocate for solutions and be creative problem solvers. That's both some of the benefits of neurodiversity and also being a good self-advocate and encouraging these skills. So once we have really strong self-advocates and we also know how to get accommodations and navigate the workplace a little bit, I like to think a little bit about the future going forward. So what does a good neurodiverse future look like? So to me, a really strong future has neurodiverse leadership, more collaboration, an inclusive culture, and aligning people to their strengths all across the spectrum, no matter what kind of environment we're in. Whether you work at a grocery store, whether you're in a place that is smaller or bigger, or you're a corporate attorney or you're a programmer, whatever it is you're doing, that you should be able to do something that makes you happy and you should feel welcomed and accepted. That's all we can want for our young people and ourselves. So when I talk about neurodiverse leadership, I mean we want long-term careers, not just jobs. So people often think that the buck stops because you got a job. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. So probably the hardest things to come by once you're in the door are things like mentors and giving people the opportunity to grow. So more professional development, establishing mentoring relationships, letting them try new things, and also becoming part of leadership and executive teams. And also even thinking about paying it forward. So what if going forward, when we do these interviews and all these things that I think have a lot of bias, if we had neurodiverse people doing interviews and hiring, so we saw that from that other perspective? Are we going to have more open-mindedness? Are we going to be more objective? What are we going to see? And those are things that make me really excited about the future, is that young people like me will one day be in charge of things. And hopefully that means we'll get a little bit of a better world as we work and go forward. And that's something that I would really like to see. Someone just asked where they can see the slides afterwards. And just so you know, you will get a copy of them either from me, you can email me, or I will make sure that Katie and Mary and everyone here at Stone Soup can provide them to you. So fear not, friends, you will get your slides if you want them. I try to be good about that stuff. And again, they have all sorts of cool features if you have visual impairments too. So I got you covered. Fear not. I don't want anyone to be nervous because I know that I talk fast and I know we have a lot to talk about usually. And I also want to make sure that I have lots of time to answer all of your questions and have a longer discussion with everyone too. So that brings me to our next point that makes me really happy, is this idea of having a culture of acceptance and inclusion, which is one of those things that I'll tell when I get to talk to big corporations and they go, okay, yeah, that's great. And I'm like, well, chances are you already have employees with autism and people who are neurodiverse wherever you are, but they're not all going to be open about it. They might not disclose. There's all sorts of reasons why. Here's the thing though. When somebody who is important or seems to have authority is open about who they are and express any vulnerability, the more junior people on the totem pole will do the exact same thing. They too will be open and vulnerable. So last semester, I taught college kids. I had a wonderful group of about 15 students, and I love them all dearly. So if any of you know my students or you've connected with my students, and my students are very much still following me on social media, they like to talk to me. It's very cool because now they are no longer my kids. So my kids at this point, or at that point in the semester, had never had an autistic professor before. And I had at least 3 people in my class who identified as having disabilities or were neurodivergent in some way, shape, or form. So I believe I had 1 person who was on the spectrum or 2 on the spectrum. One of them was open about it in class. The other told me privately, things like that. And I know they wouldn't have told other professors unless they needed accommodations. And both of these students did not have any accommodations from me. And I thought it was really powerful when they were sharing these things about themselves. And I had other students sharing very personal things. And I realized it's because I set the stage as someone who was openly autistic for them, that they felt comfortable sharing things they might not have shared with other members of the faculty. It was a moment that really meant a lot to me. And I realized that the same thing happens at work. So when I spoke to one of the chief diversity officers at a major company, they told me that one of the senior vice presidents was talking about her experience as someone who is LGBTQ. And when she shared that with her team, other people started coming out too. So when we have this vulnerability, people feel comfortable sharing who they are. If you are somewhere big, you might have these things called special interest groups or resource groups or affinity groups. And oftentimes there is one related to disability or neurodiversity. It is very, very cool. I have never worked anywhere big enough to see them, but they're informal, they're employee-led. Sometimes they have money. Sometimes lots of parents of kids with disabilities join them seeking support from one another. I think it's very cool. If you are part of one, please let me know. And I think that's a really good way for people to connect with each other, to make friends, do whatever they have to do, or to feel supported and welcome somewhere too. We can also align people to their strengths. So some places think that because I'm autistic, that means that I am really good at math and science. I have something to tell you all. I went to law school. Do you know why a lot of people go to law school? They're not very good at math and science. They like things with writing and logic and reasoning and creative thinking. They have different skills than people that go into the sciences. It's just, I don't make the rules. So it's really awkward when I'm asked to do very technical tasks that require a lot of technology and math and things, because that's the stereotype of autism. It's not aligning me to my strengths. It makes me very uncomfortable. It makes me frustrated, and it makes me seem like I'm bad at my job. So please think about what people are good at. A lot of times with disability, we focus on what people can't do and not what they're actually really good at. So no matter how much somebody struggles, how much they seem to be bad at, or how much they just are having challenges with, everybody is good at stuff. Everybody is good at something. Everybody has talents. It's up to us to find those and help people be aligned to them, whether it's hobbies or potential careers. So I like to write and I like to talk. You can only imagine that's why I went to law school and became a lawyer, right? So that kind of helps explain things. I also think it's important that we become good communicators, and whatever that means. Some people are really good communicating over text and talking. Some people not so much. If you text and email me, chances are I might have more to say, or I might be better at it because sometimes I just lose words because life is hard. So however we communicate, and as long as we do it openly and we're open-minded, we do pretty great. Something else that happens at work, and I really love seeing this from the bigger companies, and when I get to challenge them on this, it makes me very, very happy, is that when they get trainings on autism and disability, it's often telling people with disabilities how to act around everybody else. So I have seen neurotypical led trainings telling me how to be integrated and fit in with everyone, when really it's that everybody else needs to know how to interact with me and how not to make me feel like I have to pretend to be somebody I'm not, and things like that. And the coolest things that happen are when you have people with disabilities leading these conversations for everybody. It's really powerful and it means a lot. And that's also, again, part of why I'm glad that I get to be here today too, because that lived experience goes a long way. And so does actually sometimes knowing some stuff that is related. So I'm not just saying bring in the first person with a disability that you meet or that seems to be within, but someone who also has both professional and personal experience. It goes a long way, and it shows that representation truly matters. And of course, when we talk about focusing on the strengths, I wanted to show this really cool thing from both the University of Leeds and Autism Speaks, and it kind of focuses on some of those autistic strengths. So I like to show this when we think so much about deficits and things that are difficult. Look at all these things that people are actually really good at. So we have these attention to details. We have these deep focus, this observational skills, the ability to absorb and retain facts, visual skills, expertise, methodical approaches, new approaches, creativity. We might be resilient and tenacious, accepting of other people who are different. And of course, we have integrity and are honest and loyal. And I think that goes a long way for a lot of us. And a lot of these are values and strengths that a lot of us should be working on or having in our lives, whether they're personal traits or how our minds work, or we're just care about one another or the things that we do. And I think together we can get really, really far, especially when it comes to neurodiversity. And I think that as parents and employers, no matter what situation we're in, there's always something we could do to help our young people with disabilities and our young autistic and neurodivergent people continue to grow, and that they can stand up for themselves and others, and that we can actually be self-aware, empowered, and confident in order to keep moving forward and to live lives that are as independent as possible, and be able to show that we have a lot to offer the world too. Because here's the thing, don't sell us short. We're ready for the world. It's just the world isn't always ready for us. And it's up to you to help the world be ready for us, and to help your young people be ready for the world. So if you want to continue this conversation and you don't want to ask a question to everybody here, or you just don't want to have your name show up, or you just want to have some more one-on-one time or whatever it might be, feel free to connect with me on social media, or you can send me an email. Please mention that we met here at the conference, because sometimes I get kind of confused when people email me and I don't know them, because I still have a little bit of privacy concern. I always am one of those people. So please mention that we met here, and I will do my best to take care of you. And I thank you all for listening. I hope we learned something today, and that there's something that we can do, because there's always something that we can do for our young people, and that we can keep moving forward so we have better inclusion all the way around. So I'm happy to help with as many questions, concerns, or if you just want to share feelings. So that's what I do with my students. If they don't have questions, but they have a reaction or something as well, they're allowed to share their feelings. So if you want to share questions, comments, feelings, whatever it may be, I welcome that. And thank you for your time.